I started working at a hospital in October 2023. I needed the job badly, and sterile processing seemed easy enough, cleaning surgical instruments and delivering them back to the operating rooms. Decent pay, manageable hours, and I figured I'd be working behind the scenes so nothing too crazy could happen. My supervisor, Janet, showed me around during my first week. The hospital was like a maze, with these long corridors connecting different wings. She taught me the routes between departments. The longest one took me through what everyone called the main corridor, this seemingly endless hallway that connected surgical services to the patient wards on the east side. "You'll get used to all the sounds," Janet told me. "Hospitals are never really quiet. There's always something beeping or humming somewhere." She was right. During my first few days, I learned to tune out the constant noise, ventilation systems, medical equipment, distant chatter from nursing stations. It all just became background noise after a while. It was Thursday of my first week when I first heard it. I was pushing a cart of sterilized instruments toward the orthopedic ward around 5:30 in the evening. The wheels were echoing against the floor as I went down the main corridor. About halfway there, I noticed this additional sound mixed in with the usual hospital noise. At first, it was barely noticeable, just this faint, high-pitched noise drifting from somewhere ahead of me. I thought it was equipment malfunction, or maybe the building's old HVAC system acting up. Hospitals are full of mechanical sounds. But as I kept walking, the sound got more distinct, more unsettling. By the time I delivered my cart, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The noise had changed from background static into something that made my jaw clench. It was relentless, never changing pitch or volume. My shift was over, but I had to know what it was. Instead of clocking out, I decided to follow the sound. I told myself I was being responsible. If equipment was broken, someone should report it. I followed it deeper into the east wing, past departments I'd never seen. The noise got louder with each step, and gradually, I started to realize what it actually was. This wasn't mechanical. This was coming from something alive. Nurses were rushing in and out of a room at the far end of the corridor, their faces looking exhausted and desperate. One nurse, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, actually had her hands pressed over her ears as she hurried past me. She looked like she'd been fighting a losing battle for hours. The sound was clearly coming from that room, a continuous ear-piercing shriek that never paused, never changed pitch, never showed any variation. It was the kind of noise that seemed to drill straight into your skull. I walked toward it slowly, even though every instinct told me to turn around. Through the partially open door, I could see people in scrubs moving frantically around a bed. The lights in the room kept flickering, which made everything look even more nightmarish. Then one of the doctors rushed out and nearly ran into me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic. Behind him, the door swung open for just a moment. That's when I saw him. The patient was a man, maybe in his 50s, though his condition made it hard to tell. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin that had this disturbing bluish-gray color. His hair was matted with sweat, and there were dark circles around his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. But his mouth, that's what will haunt me forever. It was stretched impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to open. The corners of his lips were cracked and bloody from the strain. I could see his entire throat exposed, muscles and tendons that shouldn't be visible, and from that gaping hole came the most horrific sound I've ever heard. It wasn't just screaming, it was something beyond what humans should be able to do, a continuous, unwavering shriek that never paused for breath, never showed any sign that he needed air. The pitch was so high it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. Our eyes met across the room, and for what felt like forever, I stared into pure, conscious agony. His eyes were bloodshot and bulging, with veins visible across his forehead and temples. There was intelligence there, awareness, which made it infinitely worse. This wasn't an unconscious patient. This was a man who was fully aware of whatever he was experiencing. The sound never stopped, not for a single second. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Time seemed to stop around that horrible, continuous scream. But eventually, another nurse spotted me and quickly shut the door. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice shaking. She was young, probably new like me, and I could see tears in her eyes. "Please, just go. There's nothing anyone can do." "How long has this been going on?" I asked. She looked at me with exhausted, haunted eyes. "Since Tuesday morning, 3 days now. He hasn't stopped once." 3 days. 72 hours of continuous screaming without pause. I walked back to my department in a daze and drove home in complete silence. Every time I tried to turn on the radio, my hands would shake. Any sound that resembled that pitch made my skin crawl. That night, I barely slept. When I did drift off, I dreamed of that stretched mouth and those conscious, terrified eyes. I kept waking up in cold sweats, convinced I could still hear the screaming. The next day, I called in sick. I couldn't go back knowing that sound might still be there. I spent the day researching medical conditions online, trying to find some explanation. But everything I read said sustained vocalization like that is physically impossible. The larynx needs rest. Vocal cords are muscles, and muscles get tired. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. When I finally went back on Monday, I avoided the East Wing completely. I took longer routes, added extra steps, anything to stay away from that part of the hospital. But during lunch, I overheard 2 surgical nurses talking. "Thank God that nightmare in 347 is finally over," one said. "The screamer," the other replied. "I heard he finally passed Friday night. Poor guy. I've never seen anything like it in 15 years. My blood went cold. "What happened to him?" They looked at each other before one answered. "Some kind of complication during emergency surgery earlier in the week. Anesthesia awareness, they think. But it was like nothing we'd ever seen. He screamed for 3 straight days without stopping, not once. We tried everything, sedatives, pain meds, even emergency intubation. Nothing worked." "That's not medically possible," I said. "I know," she replied quietly. "That's what made it so terrifying. It shouldn't have been possible, but we all witnessed it. The entire East Wing heard him. Some staff are requesting transfers." They didn't want to talk about it more, and I understood why. How do you process witnessing something that goes against everything you know about human bodies? I've been working here for months now, and nobody mentions it anymore. It's like the entire staff decided to forget it happened, but I can't forget. I still have nightmares about that man and his impossibly wide mouth. Sometimes I wake up thinking I can hear him screaming, but it's just the wind or a siren. But the worst part is the questions. What kind of pain makes someone scream for 3 days straight? How is it physically possible to make sound for that long without rest? And if he was conscious during those 72 hours, what was he trying to say through that endless, horrifying scream? I've tried to explain it to myself. Maybe the hospital acoustics created echo effects. Maybe multiple patients were screaming at once. Maybe my mind filled in details that weren't real. But I can't shake the memory of those conscious, terrified eyes staring back at me from that stretched mouth. Whatever was happening to him, he knew it was happening. And screaming was the only way he could communicate it. Sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet, I wonder if other people have memories like this, experiences so far outside normal understanding that we choose to forget them rather than think about what they mean. I hope I never find out. I was working hospital security, and this was only my 2nd night shift. I was brand new to the job. Training happens during the day for a week. Then they put you on nights if that's your schedule. This was 4 years ago. There were 2 other officers with me that night, Eric, who was also new, only his 2nd week of employment, and Jay, who everyone called Edgelord because that's what he called himself. Eric was this happy-go-lucky, give me a reason to put my hands on you kind of guy, always joking around. Jay was completely different, really tall, serious-looking, with this deep voice and darker sense of humor, but actually a fun guy to be around. Since I was the only female security officer, the guys had taken this big brother approach with me. Jay insisted he'd be the one to go with me to patrol the historic building while Eric handled the parking garage. I think it was because he felt protective or something. The hospital used to be owned by a different company before the current owners, and that company is bankrupt now. But back then they had way more relaxed policies and rules. Maintenance would often bring folding chairs and camping chairs up to the roof of the historic building to hang out during their breaks. You couldn't see them from the ground because there's a 4-foot wall around the edge of the roof. The problem was they constantly forgot to lock the roof access door when they were done. So Jay was clearing the roof since maintenance had forgotten to lock the door again, while I was patrolling the 5th floor, yes, the infamous 5th floor, twisting doorknobs as I walked down the hallway to make sure they were all locked properly. I was getting near the end of the corridor, where there's this window that looks out over the top level of the parking garage, when I heard footsteps behind me. But these weren't normal footsteps. These were running footsteps, actually sprinting at me, and the speed sounded almost inhuman, like someone was charging down that hallway at full speed. I turned around so fast I almost knocked my shoulder mic off my shirt, but when I spun around, there was nobody behind me. The hallway was completely empty. just me standing there with my heart racing. I immediately jumped on my radio and called for position requests from both Jay and Eric, thinking they were playing some kind of prank on the new girl. Jay replied that he was still on the roof. Eric said he was coming up to the top level of the parking garage. I looked out the window toward the garage, and there was Eric, waving his flashlight so I could see him. Both guys were exactly where they said they were, which meant neither of them could have been running down that hallway behind me. The thing that really got to me was how real those footsteps sounded. They weren't distant or muffled, like sounds from another floor. They were right there in the hallway with me. Heavy, running steps, like someone in boots sprinting across the linoleum. And the speed was what freaked me out most. No normal person runs that fast down a hospital corridor, especially not at 3 in the morning. I tried to think of logical explanations, maybe pipes settling, or heating system noises, or something from the floor above. But I knew the difference between mechanical sounds and footsteps. These were definitely footsteps, and they were definitely running straight at me. When Jay came back down from the roof, I told him what happened. He didn't seem surprised at all, like he was expecting something like this, which bothered me. He just nodded and said, "Yeah, weird things happen here sometimes, especially on night shifts." Eric met us back in the building, and when I explained what I heard, he got this look on his face like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. The rest of that shift was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that hallway with me. Something that could run faster than any person should be able to. Something that could move completely silently, except for when it wanted you to hear it approaching. That was my first real encounter, and it changed everything for me. Up until then, I thought hospital security would be straightforward. Dealing with confused patients, occasional trespassers, maybe some theft. I never expected to be dealing with things that couldn't be explained. What really bothers me, thinking back, is how targeted it felt. Those footsteps weren't random. They were coming straight for me. Like whatever it was had been waiting for someone to be alone in that hallway. And when I turned around, it just vanished completely, like it had never been there at all. I'll never forget that night. It was the first time I realized I wasn't just patrolling for homeless people, or trespassers, or maintenance issues. That night changed my life and made me believe in things I never thought were possible before. 4 years later, I still work those night shifts, and I still patrol that 5th floor. But now I know what I'm really dealing with. And that first night was just the beginning. I work as a behavioral health technician, and back in September, I landed what seemed like the perfect job at a luxury drug and alcohol rehabilitation facility. When I say luxury, I mean it. This place is absolutely massive, a sprawling mansion that looks like something straight out of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, maybe even bigger. Picture a mini White House with pristine white columns and manicured grounds that stretch for acres. The facility has 3 floors and 13 rooms, each with its own private bathroom complete with jacuzzi tubs. There's a fully equipped gym, 3 separate living rooms, a commercial-grade kitchen that could serve a restaurant, and even a ballroom that doubles as a yoga studio. The gardens are immaculate. There's a doctor's office on site, and they even have an elevator. For a rehab facility, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The interview process itself had been surprisingly quick. Most places like this put you through multiple rounds of interviews, background checks that take weeks, and extensive reference calls. But here I had 1 phone screening and 1 in-person interview, and they offered me the position on the spot. The salary they quoted was almost double what I'd been making at my previous facility, which should have been my first red flag. But when you're drowning in student loans and barely scraping by, you don't question good fortune too closely. During the tour, they showed me around during the day when everything looked bright and welcoming. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows made the whole place feel warm and inviting. Clients were participating in group therapy sessions, others were working out in the gym, and the common areas buzzed with quiet conversation. It felt like a high-end resort more than a medical facility. What they didn't mention during the tour was how different the building felt at night, how the long hallways seemed to stretch on forever in the dim emergency lighting, how sounds carried differently through the empty spaces, echoing in ways that made you second-guess what you'd actually heard. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m., which means I'm there through the night when most clients are sleeping. It's just me and 1 nurse rattling around in this enormous house for 8.5 hours. The silence can be overwhelming sometimes. During the day, this place is alive with activity, but at night it transforms into something completely different. The shadows seem longer, the hallways feel wider, and every small sound gets amplified in the stillness. My office is on the 2nd floor, positioned right at the end of a long corridor lined with client rooms. The nurse's station is downstairs along with the kitchen and a large pantry that stays locked at all times. That pantry is massive, probably the size of a small bedroom. and it's packed floor to ceiling with supplies. Only the nurse has the key to that pantry, which always struck me as odd since other staff members often need access to supplies throughout the shift. The building layout itself is somewhat confusing. With 3 floors and so many rooms, it's easy to get turned around, especially in the dim lighting we use during night shifts. There are several staircases, multiple hallways that seem to lead nowhere, and rooms that I still haven't figured out the purpose of. The elevator makes noise when it runs, a low mechanical hum that you can hear throughout the building. So whenever someone uses it, everyone knows. During my first week, 2 different clients casually mentioned that the place was haunted. The first one, Maria, was a woman in her 50s who'd been there for about 3 weeks already. She was sitting in one of the living rooms during my rounds when she looked up from her book and said, "You know this place is haunted, right?" She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. I laughed it off and asked her what she meant. She told me she'd heard people walking around upstairs in the middle of the night, doors opening and closing, and sometimes voices in rooms that were supposed to be empty. She seemed completely serious about it, but I figured she was probably just hearing other staff members doing their rounds, or maybe withdrawal was affecting her sleep patterns. The second client, David, mentioned it a few days later. He was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, and he seemed pretty grounded overall. He cornered me in the hallway one night around 2 a.m. and said, "Has anyone told you about the old people who used to live here?" When I asked what he meant, he explained that he'd been researching the building's history online and found out it used to be a high-end retirement community. He said he'd seen an elderly woman in a white nightgown walking through the hallways twice, always around the same time, between 2 and 3 a.m. According to him, she'd walk from one end of the second-floor hallway to the other, then just disappear into the wall where there used to be a door. I dismissed this as well, figuring he was probably seeing shadows, or maybe hallucinating from his medications. But looking back, I should have paid more attention to how serious they both seemed when they told me these things. For the first few weeks, everything was relatively normal, though I did start noticing things that seemed off. The building settled and creaked constantly, which I expected from an older structure. But some of the sounds didn't quite fit that pattern. I'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the hallway above my office, even though I knew all the clients on that floor were asleep. The footsteps had a distinct rhythm, not rushed, but deliberate, like someone taking their time walking from one end of the hall to the other. I also started noticing that the temperature would fluctuate in weird ways. Some nights I'd be sitting in my perfectly climate-controlled office and suddenly feel a wave of cold air, like someone had opened a door to the outside. But when I'd check, all the doors and windows were sealed tight. The building had an excellent HVAC system, so these temperature drops didn't make any logical sense. The elevator was another source of constant unease. During night shifts, no one should be using it except for emergencies. But at least twice a week, I'd hear that mechanical hum, indicating someone was riding it between floors. When I'd check the security monitors, the elevator would be empty, just running on its own. The day staff mentioned they'd had maintenance check it multiple times, but they never found any mechanical issues. Around my 3rd week, I started keeping a mental log of when these strange occurrences happened. The footsteps upstairs were almost always between 2:30 and 3:15 a.m. The temperature drops typically occurred around 1:45 a.m. and again around 4:20 a.m. The elevator seemed to run on its own mostly in the early hours, between midnight and 2 a.m. The consistency was what really started to get to me. Random building settling wouldn't follow such a predictable schedule. I also began to notice that some of the clients seemed to be affected by whatever was happening. During my rounds, I'd find people who were normally deep sleepers sitting up in bed, looking toward their doors like they were listening for something. When I'd ask if everything was okay, they'd say they heard someone walking in the hallway, but I hadn't seen anyone out there. A few clients mentioned hearing their doorknobs rattle slightly, like someone was testing to see if the doors were locked. Then, about a month into the job, something happened that I couldn't rationalize or explain away. I was in my office around 2 a.m. catching up on some paperwork when I heard the nurse come stomping up the stairs. She was practically yelling, and she sounded angry. When she reached my office, she started going off about how I'd scared her by hiding in the pantry and yelling knock knock at her. I stared at her, completely confused. I told her I hadn't left my office all night, which was true. I'd been sitting at my desk for hours. When I said this, her face went completely pale. She just stood there for a moment and then she said, "You weren't just in the pantry. You didn't yell knock knock?" I told her no, and then I asked the obvious question. How could I have been in the pantry when she had the only key? She didn't answer. She just walked out of my office without saying another word. About 10 minutes later, I started hearing her voice downstairs, but it wasn't like she was talking to someone. It was more rhythmic, almost like chanting. My curiosity got the better of me, so I went down to check on her. When I got to her office, I found her on her knees, praying in what I later learned was Punjabi. She was completely absorbed in her prayers, rocking back and forth slightly. I didn't want to interrupt, so I quietly went back upstairs. But I couldn't shake the image of how terrified she'd looked when I told her I hadn't been in the pantry. The next morning at 6 a.m., the chef and handyman clocked in for their shifts. They always asked how our night went, so I decided to make light of the situation. I jokingly told them that Casper had scared Nurse J in the pantry. The chef's reaction caught me completely off guard. Instead of laughing, his expression got serious and he said, "Oh, that's Kay. If it was in the pantry, that's definitely Kay." I asked him what he meant, and that's when he dropped a bombshell. He'd been working at the facility for 15 years, he said, and the building used to be a retirement home. A lot of residents had passed away there over the years. He started naming off different residents and describing where their spirits had been seen around the building. According to him, Kay was one of the former residents who'd spent a lot of time in the kitchen area. She'd been the type of person who liked to help with meal preparation and was always poking around the pantry. He said the hauntings weren't malicious. The spirits were just kind of there, going about their business like they had when they were alive. 2 weeks later, Nurse J put in her 2 weeks' notice. She never explicitly said it was because of what happened in the pantry, but the timing seemed pretty clear. She left without training a replacement, which meant we were short-staffed for a while. Since then, I've started paying more attention to the little things that happen during my shifts. I hear footsteps in the hallway fairly regularly, especially around 3 a.m. The lights flicker sometimes, though that could be the old electrical system. What's harder to explain is how the fireplaces will randomly turn on by themselves. I'll be sitting in my office and suddenly hear the whoosh of gas igniting, and when I go check, one of the fireplaces in the living rooms will be burning away. I haven't had anything speak to me directly like what happened to Nurse J, but I've definitely felt watched. Sometimes I'll be walking down the hallway and get the strongest sensation that someone is right behind me, but when I turn around, there's nothing there. My supervisor mentioned during my interview that they have trouble keeping the night shift staffed, which is why my pay is significantly higher than average for this type of position. At the time, I thought it was just because night shifts are harder to fill in general. Now I'm wondering if the real reason is that word has gotten around about the building's history. The funny thing is, I'm not really scared. Maybe I should be, but the encounters feel more curious than threatening. If Kay really is hanging around the pantry where she used to help with food prep, that doesn't seem particularly menacing. The footsteps in the hallway could be any number of former residents just going about their routines. I've been working there for several months now, and honestly, the pay is too good to walk away from. If sharing the building with a few friendly spirits is the trade-off for a salary that's well above market rate, I think I can handle that. Besides, in a weird way, it's kind of comforting to know that people who once called this place home are still looking out for it. Though I have to admit, I always make sure to announce myself loudly before I go anywhere near that pantry.